Hi, I'm Jason, the Curious Psychiatrist. Last week I talked about how the Impressionists stood at the intersection of history and art, where the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, and the Age of Enlightenment all merged to form a different method of visual expression. Today I'm going to talk about how they actually came to be and what they left behind. So let's get going. It all started when Manet submitted this, The Luncheon on the Grass, to the Salon. The Impressionists weren't a thing yet, but a small group of avant-garde painters had started to look up to him, and had also started to experiment with plein air landscape paintings and depictions of everyday life. Back then, painters were supposed to paint religious or historical scenes while tucked away in a studio with painstaking attention to detail to make the scene seem as real as possible. Naturally, this radical painting was rejected, as were nearly 3,000 others. Protests over the rejections prompted Napoleon III to open another exhibition, the Salon de Refuse, in which Manet actually debuted this to much criticism and hostility. Let's see what constituted mainstream art back then. The one on the left is The Birth of Venus by Cabanel and was accepted by the Salon that year, and Napoleon III liked it so much that he actually bought it. And on the right, The Death of a Nun by Pils was accepted by the Salon a few years before. These were the typical choices of the Salon. And the rejection brought the group closer together, so by 1866 they were meeting regularly at the Café Guerbois to discuss new ways of painting and how to present their works to the public. That year and the next, they petitioned for another Salon de Refuse, but were unsuccessful, so started scheming for an alternative method to exhibit. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 interrupted their meetings, but after the war, Manet had clearly become the key figure of the movement, as can be seen in this painting. He's the one sitting in the center with a palette, while the others stand around him. Their technique had also become more distinct. There is no one impressionist method of painting, but if you made a loose definition, it would comprise painting outside, capturing impressions based on the light, and short visible brush strokes, and less emphasis on depth, as can be seen in these paintings. This is Manet's The Concert in the Tuileries Gardens from 1862, and you can see the reduced depth and the emergence of brushstrokes. And this is The Orchestra of the Paris Opera by Degas, circa 1868, which also shows less details and more atmosphere. And in these paintings, this is by Monet and this is by Renoir, you can see large portions of the paintings are nothing but their trademark brushstrokes. They are also decidedly less detailed than the mainstream works I showed you before. You can also compare them to this. Da Vinci was a master of sfumato, a technique that enables colors to gradually transition to another without a clear boundary, and gives the painting a slightly blurry appearance. If the Mona Lisa was the ultimate in smoothness, the Impressionists were trying the opposite. After the war, the Salon of 1873 saw another unprecedented number of rejections. So petitions for another Salon de Refuse were sent, and this time the government relented, and rejected works were exhibited for the second time. A number of the refused artists were successful, and the group began serious consideration of an independent exhibition. This obsession with exhibiting might seem strange, but you have to keep in mind that there were just a bunch of young guys who were perhaps feeling insecure about their craft and wanted recognition and also a way to feed their families. And in 1874, it finally happened. That year, these guys pulled off their first independent show. Now let's look at a few pieces that were shown. A Modern Olympia by Cézanne, Hoar Frost by Pissarro, The Theater Box by Renoir, and At the Races in the Countryside by Degas. You can see their painting styles converging while also showing their independent styles. I'd love to say the exhibit was a smashing success, that it changed the world and they achieved everlasting fame. But I can't. As some of you know, the show was a complete and utter failure, with critics writing openly derogative reviews. The world was simply not ready for them. If there was one positive result, it was that they finally got their name: the Impressionists. An art critic saw this painting by Monet titled Impression Soleil Levant and gave them the name. Undeterred, they kept at it, and they had shows in 1876 and 77, but sadly to no avail. The Impressionists were not a formal school or discipline, but simply a loose group of painters who were interested in a new style of painting and were angry at the establishment. And as their fourth exhibition drew near, they started to have defections who thought that the salon was the best way to go. During this time, the art critics, who were more receptive to new art than the salon and in reality steered public opinion, were getting warmer towards their efforts. And finally, at their fourth exhibition, a sort of tipping point was reached. The change wasn't dramatic, and they didn't become household names overnight. But slowly, they started to be accepted. The pace quickened afterwards, and by the 1880s, they were now the mainstream. Their rebellion was complete. Soon, Monet's water lilies were being sold at thousands of francs, mere days after they were finished. I think as a cohesive movement, the Impressionists lasted for about 15 years from Manet's rejection to their fourth exhibition. After that, they didn't need to stick together anymore and went their separate ways. There were 4 more Impressionist exhibitions, but participants changed and later even included Gauguin and Seurat. Manet gained acceptance from the establishment and died in 1883. Renoir developed his own unique style, which was less radical than before. Pissarro experimented with pointillism before later abandoning it. Degas was never a fan of plein air painting and disliked being called an impressionist. He later became abstract. Monet continued to enjoy painting outside and later made his own garden, so he could paint at leisure. Cézanne developed a geometric style that laid the groundwork for Cubism, and the next generation of artists started to distance themselves from realism. And one of them was so radical that he won no recognition during his lifetime, but afterwards came to match the Impressionists in popularity. His name was Vincent van Gogh. Now, let's talk about what they left behind. First, this bunch of guys who were united by their defiance towards the establishment rather than deference towards a certain style started a revolution, and the art world has never looked back. On a side note, this is why I call them the Impressionists rather than using the word Impressionism. Second, they were the last of the realists. They showed the world that there was more to art than faithful reproduction. And after they showed that paintings did not have to be photographs, later artists discarded reality altogether. They started painting their thoughts. Third, they were defined by critics and journalists, but ultimately achieved individual recognition and also developed their own styles. Before them, artists were always divided into groups. Raphael was a Renaissance painter, and Rembrandt belonged in the Baroque. The Impressionists were also grouped too, but their names and individual styles came first. So Monet was Monet and Renoir was Renoir. This went further afterwards, as Van Gogh is Van Gogh and Picasso is Picasso. Lastly, they contributed to the decentralization and democratization of art. They were angry at the establishment, found a different route to success that was not the official one. And now, everyone considers artistic freedom as a given. You can now draw whatever you want, regardless of what the government says, and many artistic institutions are privately owned, and even those run by governments are usually apolitical. The process to fame and fortune has also become apolitical. You still have to jump through hoops, but the gatekeepers no longer answer to the government, and there are many different ways to success rather than just one official one. Of course, this isn't true all over the world, but it is in many places. To wrap up, I'd like to say a small group of thoughtful and committed artists ultimately changed the world. But as Will Bailey says in The West Wing, it's the only thing that has. And boy, were they incredible. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope to see you again soon.